Hello, viewers. I'm really delighted to have this conversation with Dr. Akbar Ahmed, who needs no introduction due to his eminent work and his stature within the scholars of Islam and contemporary Islam and Muslims. So we are this afternoon, we are trying to explore how and what inspired him to write his new book, which is a major, contribution to the study of the golden age of Islam, what Dr. Akbar Ahmed calls it. The book is entitled "The Flying Man: Aristotle and the Philosophers of the Golden Age of Islam." Welcome, Dr. Saab. Great to see you again.
Raza, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on your program. I know how busy you are and what great contribution you're making to the understanding and playing the role of an ambassador between the cultures of the West and the cultures of the Muslim world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. That is, in fact, what we are going to talk about, because your books, your study of contemporary Muslims, as well as digging up the great jewels of Islamic past, is something most valuable. And so, could you tell us a bit about your new book and sort of what led you to come up with this volume?
Well, Raza, it was an escape for me. I wrote it over the last months of the last year and into the early months of this year. So these are the months of the pandemic. And it was a very gloomy period. If you remember, there's all kinds of law and order problems. George Floyd had been brutally killed on our television screens. You had the Capitol riot, the attack on the Capitol building. It really was a very gloomy period for me personally, because it was also the lockdown. And this study allowed me an escape. Some people went jogging, some people took up bodybuilding in their house, some people took to the treadmill. For me, it was an escape. So I could then go back 1,000 years and sit at the feet of Ibn Arabi or Al-Ghazali or Ibn Sina and really be inspired, so that for a few hours I was in a different world and a very noble world, elevated world. And as I went deeper and deeper into this new world, this different world from which I was living here in DC, I began to realize that this is such a treasure that I need to share it with people, especially non-Muslims, who need to understand the depth, the beauty, the elegance, and the nobility of Islamic thought. And remember, this is the golden age of Islam. It's an incredible period, very rich, dense with great names. I made this point. You can have an entire period of history and you can call it by one name: Elizabethan, after Queen Elizabeth; Victorian, after Queen Victoria. But here you have these giants, Ghazali in Arabi and Ibn Rushd, and you can really call this the age of Al-Ghazali or the age of Ibn Arabi. These are giants. The second point to note here, as I was traveling in that world, was that this world of the past, the golden age, was basically a Muslim world. And that hits you. I mean, to me as a Muslim scholar and seeing what's happening in the world today, where Muslims seem to be helpless, bebas, as we say in Urdu, victims, whether they're in East Asia or South Asia or the Middle East. And here you see a Muslim world that stretches from Cordoba in the west to Bukhara in the east. And it's one global civilization. Arabic is spoken, the cultures, the culture of adab, inspired by Islam. Remember, America has not been discovered yet. South America has not been discovered. So this really is an Islamic world. And when I say Islamic world, I don't mean all people are Muslim. You also have these great Jewish scholars. For example, Rabbi Maimonides, who's one of the great philosophers of that time, but he speaks Arabic. He interacts with Muslim scholars. You have Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, who's so influenced by Ibn Rushd that he quotes Ibn Rushd 503 times. I mean, just think of this impact. So there was this great interflow of these ideas. So my purpose was to try to write a book as a kind of overview. Remember, they're great books, great biographies of these scholars, but I wanted an overview where the non-Muslim could very quickly look at it and say, oh, I've learned this about this period of history. And now I understand that when people say Muslims are against knowledge, Muslims are barbaric, Muslims haven't achieved anything in history, that's not correct. And secondly, my second target was the young Muslim, the new generation, who may or may not know so much about that part of history, because they're living in this generation, 21st century, and very often then they go back to early Islam and they skip this middle period. And I wanted to show that there was this very rich, very fertile period of history, which is well worth exploring for scholars and the young generation.
Ji, so Dr. Saab, I think for our viewers, maybe you can elaborate a little bit about the golden age of Islam that you call often, and you refer to it in your works, earlier works as well. So roughly, how long was this, and where was it, and what were the distinctive features of this age?
Yes, it was, I would say, roughly from the time of Harun al-Rashid, when he becomes the Caliph of Islam in Baghdad, 9th century. And it lasted, and it ended, it began in Baghdad in a sense, and it ended in Baghdad in 1258 when the Mongols hit it like atomic bombs. Literally, they destroyed the city, destroyed the libraries, the books, destroyed the very basis of that civilization. Now, between this period, which is a fairly long period of history, you have libraries, scholars, tremendous versatility, intellectual ferment. Let me give you one example. Cordoba, on the western side of this Muslim world that I'm talking about, is the capital of Andalusia. And Raza, think of it. Cordoba then is the largest city of Europe. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It is in Paris. It is in London. London and Paris don't even have universities then. It is Cordoba. And Cordoba's libraries are mind-blowing. You have 93 libraries in Cordoba. And the largest library, which belongs to the Caliph, has 600,000 manuscripts. When the largest library in Europe at that time, which was in Switzerland, had 600 books. So 600,000 versus 600. Now, again, these libraries, the scholarship encouraged Muslims, Jews, Christians, and it really created an ethos that I call the ilm ethos. It encouraged scholarship. So rulers would respect you irrespective of your religion. For example, Roger II of Sicily, another great ruler, not Muslim, Christian ruler, but he had great respect for learning. And his chief advisor was Idrisi. Idrisi was a Muslim. And he respected Idrisi so much that he would not sit on the throne until Idrisi had taken his seat. Or Frederick II, another great man, another great, again Christian, a Holy Roman Emperor. He actually had Arabic on his mantle. He had bodyguard that were Muslim. And he had Arabic calligraphy in his royal palace and on the throne. So, and of course, he had that great diplomatic coup, as we know in history, when he went to the Middle East in the middle of the Crusades. It's mind-boggling. And because of his great respect for Muslims, Muslims responded in kind, because you cannot continue to kill people and suppress people and expect them to love you. But you can expect them to respond with kindness if you show them kindness and respect. And this is what Frederick II did. And the king of Egypt, then Kamel, respected him so much that they said, what are we fighting for? For Jerusalem? Frederick said, what do you want? If you give me Jerusalem, what would you want in order for me to keep Jerusalem so I can say I've got Jerusalem? And the Crusades are over. And he said access to the holy places for both the Muslims and the Jews. It's very important for us to notice what the Caliph wanted from him. He said, fine, this is all done. It's yours, it's much as yours as it is mine. Let us end the fighting. So this was such a great diplomatic coup that, again, I'm surprised it's not taught in the foreign service academies in the world, because you can achieve tremendous and solve great problems by this kind of personal diplomacy. So it was a period of course, there was treachery and killing and murder and strife, which is very common in human society. But there was overall also this idea of ilm and knowledge and promoting science. And I don't have to tell you, Raza, that that period produced some of the greatest intellectuals of Europe. So that if you look at the stars and the planets, a vast number of them have Arabic names because they were discovered by Muslims. If you look at the stars, Ibn Rushd, I mentioned him, there's a crater on the moon named after. There's a crater on the moon named after Ibn Firnas, who's the first man to fly. He actually flew. Again, Cordoba, scholar, mathematician, administrator, discoverer, and he wanted to fly. So he put on some wooden wings and jumped off a hill. And they say he flew for about 10 minutes and, of course, crashed. Now, to honor him, today in Spain, if you visit Cordoba, you'll see a bridge which is in the shape of wings, huge wings. And as I said, there's a crater on the moon. So these scholars were, again, living in that environment of exploration, of intellectual vitality, and they were creating things and making an impact. And of course, Europe, which at that stage had not woken up, was noting this. And we know the story of the scholars coming from Oxford, coming to Andalusia, learning from Andalusia, going back and starting a college, and then very quickly Cambridge followed. So there was a kind of copycat effect also taking place, where Europe began to pick up these, what you would call the secrets of the golden age of Islam. And now the tragedy is, I've talked about this golden age with such enthusiasm. Yet when I was doing my study, because this is based on this bigger study that I did, the quartet for the Brookings Press, that I would go to museums, the London Museum, for example, or the museum in Paris or Madrid, and I'd ask them about history, European history. And they would invariably tell me European history goes something like this. There were the Greeks, Greek civilization. They created the Roman civilization. Then we had this period of the Dark Ages. And then came the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the discovery of America, and we were off to the modern age. So this whole period, this 1,000 years of the golden age of Islam, has dropped into a hole, into a dark hole, and it's called the Dark Ages of Europe. And I think it's critical that historians, professors, scholars, authors really reintroduce, help us rediscover the golden age of Islam and why it is so important and why it is such a critical link between past and the present, because there would be no Greeks without the Muslims, because it is Ibn Rushd and people like him, not him alone, who spent a lifetime translating Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, not only translating them, but then adding to them in theory, in discussions, in flights of fancy. So you have an incredibly rich fertilization between Greek ideas and Muslim thinking.
Yes, Dr. Sab, that's why your work I earlier mentioned is so invaluable, because it kind of addresses this huge gap in the body of knowledge, but also is a great response to the erasure of history that has taken place over the centuries. So, about coming back to your more recent work in the link to Aristotle, so can you also elaborate that a bit for our viewers, so that
Yes.
they whets their appetite and they go and actually get the book and read it?
Well, Raza, before I do that, let me actually wave the cover of the book. Is it? Can you see
Yes,
it?
it's clear. Yes,
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 the flying man. So
correct.
the flying man, of course, comes from the concept, the thought experiment of Ibn Sina. He was a brilliant man. And again, all these scholars were writing 100 books, 200 books. Ibn Arabi is supposed to have written 800 books. I mean, my mind boggles. I mean, I know you write very fast, Raza, and I pride myself on being a fast writer. But 700 books, just think of it. So these scholars were busy. They were working. They were creating. They were producing. And to me, I think their greatest achievement was that they kept this intellectual ferment alive in the Muslim world. Now, personally, I had finished this quartet for Brookings, and the quartet went like this. If you remember Lawrence Durrell, the great novelist who wrote the Alexandria Quartet, and as an undergrad, we all
Yes,
read Durrell. He's so colorful. And I was fascinated by the idea of looking at the same object from 4 different points of view. So I said, let me take this problem, quote unquote, of the West and the Muslim world. And I had thrown myself after 9/11 into trying to create bridges, trying to promote understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims, because I really felt this was going to be the biggest challenge that all Muslims faced. And Muslims are fooling themselves when they say, well, it doesn't have to do with me. Look how nice I am, and how modern I am, and how advanced I am, and everyone loves me. But they didn't realize that, as the chief rabbi of Denmark told me, a very wise man, Bent Melchior, very famous, very distinguished sage, he told me this. He said, look, one thing Muslims have to learn, that if one Jew does something bad, then the entire Jewish community is blamed. He said that this is how we feel. Everyone will say, oh, all you Jews are like this. And he said, this is how the Muslims are now feeling. So that when one Muslim does something wrong or something stupid, the entire community is cast in that same mold. And he said, you have to be very careful in the sense that that spoils the situation for all, for everyone. So those are the lessons that we learned as we traveled. And this study, the Flying Man, comes out of these quartet of studies that I conducted from the four corners of the world, literally. So the first one looked at the same problem, the West and the Muslim world, from America's point of view. So I wrote a book called Journey into America. I made a film, a documentary. Then Europe, Journey into Europe, I made a film on that. Then Journey into Islam, and finally the Thistle and the Drone, which is looking at the world and the same problem through the perspective of the tribesmen. And this, Raza, as a scholar, you'll appreciate, is very often overlooked, because people analyze war on terror or the post 9/11 world in terms of what is Delhi saying, or Islamabad saying, or Cairo saying, not in terms of what the Wazir are saying, what the Masood are saying. And very often the focus of the conflict are these tribes. So there's a lack of understanding of the tribes. There's certainly a lack of sympathy for the tribes. And very often central government treats them shabbily. They try to really, wherever they are, they try to extract their resources to almost in a neo-colonial way. And they treat them with a cultural contempt. And that, of course, creates a tension. And then you have the war on terror, and you have all the ingredients for an explosion, which is what we saw and are seeing. I think a lot of these peripheral areas are still in trouble. Now, when I finished the last project, Journey into Europe, I was almost led into thinking along these lines that led me to the Flying Man. And it began with the notion of the Flying Man itself. It comes from Ibn Sina, who has a thought experiment. And he says, now imagine a man who wears a blindfold. He's suspended in air, so his hands are tied like this, his legs are tied, he's up in the air. He can't feel anything, he can't see anything, his eyes are blindfolded. And he, at that moment, still knows that he has something. He does not know whether he's got a body or not, because he can't feel it. But he knows that he has what could be called a soul. And that, of course, as you know, Raza, is the equivalent of what Descartes, centuries later, would come up with his own famous saying, I think, therefore I am. See, so it's coming from that. So I just I was fascinated by this thought experiment. And I said to myself, stepping back, again, I'm looking at it as a philosopher, as a scholar, and I'm saying some of the world's great philosophic experiments. There is Plato and the Allegory of the Cave. Now, this is one of the most famous, as you know, thought experiments of history. And that the prisoner escapes from the cave. They're all used to seeing the shadows on the wall, the fires being lit from behind them, so they're seeing shadows on the wall. And their captors are saying that that is reality. This one prisoner escapes and comes to the top, and he sees the sunshine and the trees and the beautiful view around, the vistas up on the surface. And he comes back to try to rescue the other prisoners and tell them, guys, this is not reality. There's a more beautiful reality outside. That is reality. And they don't accept it. They start getting angry, and then they want to beat him up. And in the end, they're violent towards him. So that's the second great experiment, which is famous. And the third, of course, to my mind, the great philosophic intellectual experiment for all of us, history, is that of Nietzsche and the idea of the Übermensch, where Nietzsche argues that we have, as a human species, advanced to a point where we really need to develop our own individual capabilities as human beings, as men and women, so that we enhance our capabilities to the point where we become supermen. And of course, this concept is controversial because, as we know, it was very much misused by the Nazis, and therefore Nietzsche died long before Hitler came to power. But then, in retrospect, Nietzsche was then sort of blamed for this. In fact, that's a caricature of Nietzsche's philosophic thought. So these ideas, I believe, have so much to teach us, these great philosophic ideas. I'm just touching the surface. And in my book, I uh, try to bring out some of these lessons for us through the lives of these great philosophers. For example, Al-Ghazali. Now, again, Ghazali is controversial because at a very young age, he became like a superstar. Now, think again, Raza, here's a very interesting fact for you, that this Ghazali, who's in the 30s, he's in early 30s, he is what a British historian of Ghazali described. He's the equivalent of holding the Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford and being the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's his status. And he's mid-30s. And he gets all the honor and the glamour and the status of this position. But then he realizes that this is empty. This is bureaucracy. It means nothing. The people who are respecting him are really respecting his chair. You know, you've held positions of importance and you know what that is. So he is very disillusioned. And one day he stands up to speak and he has these huge audiences, 10,000, 15,000 people come to hear him, and he can't speak. He's had a nervous breakdown. And he just packs up and he says, no, I'm going to find the path myself. And here you have the classic Muslim who's had a breakdown, who leaves everything. You could call this the Buddha model, if you like. And he goes off in search of the truth. And for the next 10 years, he wanders about as a Sufi. He's seen in Damascus sweeping the floors of the mosque. And when he comes back, he does something which is seminal in Islam. He reconciles Sufi thinking, the Sufi stream of Islam, to the Sharia, to orthodox formal Islam. This is a huge achievement. Ibn Arabi, again, a huge figure and a big name for us, because he also does something similar. He leaves his very comfortable home in Andalusia and leaves for the East. He comes to the Middle East, the Muslim world, and he wanders about writing his poems, writing his books, giving lectures, and changing people's lives. Again, he was controversial. Why? Because he was a Sufi. He was much more of a Sufi than Ghazali. And his own autobiography and his writings are very honest. They're very, very bold. For example, he points out that he was inspired and he was taught by a female mystic in Andalusia, who was 95 years old and played the tambourine. But she inspired him. And as we know, women have played a very important role in this golden age. Remember, one of the oldest universities in the world, probably the oldest at Fez, was started by a woman. So women are playing a very critical role in this golden age. And Ibn Arabi, of course, I was fascinated because very early on in his life, he's recounting this himself. He said, I was in Cordoba, we were with friends, we were having dinner and wonderful young men enjoying themselves. And he said, I picked up a glass of wine. And he said, then I heard a voice telling me, calling my name and saying, we did not create you for this. You have a bigger purpose. So, you know, he felt very nervous, rattled. He put down the glass and he ran out. And he ended up in the cemetery, in the local cemetery, where he says he saw a vision of the prophets. Jesus came to him. And Jesus made a big impact on him, because from then on, he would call Jesus a friend. He would call him a guide. And like Jesus, who Jesus' followers, like St. Francis famously, they gave up their clothes and they gave up their belongings and they went off to search for the truth and search for simplicity and compassion and look for compassion. He followed that path. And of course, the prophet, our own prophet, was his ultimate hero. And the notion of insan-e kamil, the perfect man, is very much developed by Ibn Arabi. Wahadat al-Wujud. Again, these are concepts that are coming from Ibn Arabi. So I'm just giving you a sense of what these great philosophers were doing and the level they reached. Ghazali in particular, he writes after his wanderings, he comes back and he sums it up in his magnum opus, which is called The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ya Ulum al-Din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, in 40 volumes. Again, Raza, I want you to think, 40 volumes. We haven't written that in our whole life. But that's his major book. And they say about this book, and now I'm quoting Sheikh Hakim Murad at Cambridge, who's a great scholar of Ghazali, that he called him a saint. He said he's a saint and probably the greatest Muslim scholar in history. And another Arab scholar in the past had said if all the books of Islam were destroyed and one book had to survive, in order for Islam to survive, it would be the revival of the religious sciences. So I'm surprised how we can assume that that period of history has nothing to teach us. And then let me give you another lesson why we need to know about that period. We are living in this very challenging time. You've got COVID, you've got what's happening in the Middle East right now. You have so many challenges that the Muslim world faces. Every time you open the television, you have some crisis, whether it's Myanmar, the Rohingya, Sri Lanka, wherever you see Kashmir, you have problems of the Muslims. And then I said, how do we survive in this? And here are the lessons for us, Raza. Because Rumi and Ibn Arabi, remember this, are at the heart of the Muslim world, this vast Muslim world that I pointed out from Cordoba to Bukhara. They are at the heart of this. And what is hitting this world? From the east come wave upon wave of the Crusaders. From the west, from the east comes the wave upon wave of the Mongols. The Muslim world is being hammered from both, and not just hammered. I mean, it's literally like what's happening in the Middle East. You've got this hammering going on, and Rumi's family has to escape from what is Afghanistan into Persia, then into Turkey, because they're right ahead of the Mongols who are right behind them. So in that turmoil, in that chaos, in that violence, they give us a path, they give us a model of how to cope with this very violent, changing world. And how to cope is really to develop your inner self. This is what the Buddhists say, this is what Confucius says, this is what all the great religions, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism, they all say, look inside you and develop inside. And this is exactly what they teach us, that you must develop a sense of balance, of qanaat, of compassion, of really understanding the world as something that's created and which is beyond you. You can't sit and say that, okay, I'm going to be worried and therefore God will do something. God may or may not do something, but that does not mean that your faith in your tradition, in your religion, in your belief in God weakens. That is a very clear-cut instruction that we have from the divine. So if Ibn Arabi could survive, if Rumi could survive, then certainly we could also take lessons and develop ourselves in a way that we're able to sustain the blows that this world is inflicting on us at this stage in history, which is a difficult time. But again, we can learn from these great masters, the great philosophers of the Muslim world. And I must point out I had mentioned, Raza, that the interaction here, and this is another great aspect of this study of mine, that the interfaith aspect. Very often I'm involved, you're involved with interfaith initiatives. We meet, we have a lunch or dinner maybe, and we all go home. But I wanted to show from this book, the little book, and by the way, it is available at Amana Publications, which is the book, which is the publishers which published Yusuf Ali's great translation of the Holy Quran. That's its claim to fame. It's a very famous translation. I wanted to point out that this was a time when there was so much genuine interfaith interaction that if you read, for example, Rabbi Maimonides, which I have read, and I really admire that man. He's a man of great practicality, common sense. And if you read him and then you read Ibn Rushd, you're going to say, now, wait a minute. Where does Islam stop and where does Judaism begin? It's that much alike. Or if you read St. Thomas Aquinas, I pointed out that he's in fact quoting Ibn Rushd and Ghazali, not just Ibn Rushd, but also Ghazali, because they're taking, St. Thomas Aquinas is taking this great conflict within theology between faith and reason. You remember there was a big debate at that time. Even
Yes.
now, I think you see it
Even now, yeah.
even now in the villages, you'll see some religious scholars will say, we don't want science because that's against religion. That's anti-Islam. It is Ibn Rushd who establishes that science, that is reason, these are completely compatible with faith, with the Sharia. This is what he established over a lifetime of work. And this was picked up by St. Thomas Aquinas and all the great scholars. This is, of course, radical. And they accepted it and absorbed it. So these are, again, great lessons for us in our time. I mean, we think this dilemma is over, the problem's over. It isn't. It exists in our time. And I really believe that that time was different in the way Muslims looked at the universe. It was a Muslim world. It was a Muslim language. It was Muslim culture and Muslim values. There was great confidence among the Muslims. So you can see this from the work they were doing. This is a different world we are living in. We could say that we are at the opposite end almost of the spectrum. We're right at the bottom. But this contact with the golden age gives you a great boost. It gives you a moral boost. It gives you a confidence. It gives you a capacity to stick your chest out and walk around with great confidence, say, this is who we were. This is what we had achieved. And to then for us to say to the younger generation, why can't we encourage you to reach this level again? There's nothing stopping you. And we go back to one of the greatest core beliefs in Islam, which is the emphasis on ilm, on knowledge. Because as you know, the Quran uses the word knowledge more than any other word except the word for God. That's how much it emphasizes knowledge. And the secret of the golden age is knowledge, 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 knowledge. And as you know, Raza, you look up the education figures for the Muslim world, and I say this with great sadness. They really, I wouldn't say sad, they're pathetic, 2%, 1%, 3%. We are not serious about education. If we were, we would not have these educational figures. And this is, I would say, generally throughout the Muslim world. You may have a couple of exceptions. Now, I have a quote from one of the distinguished Arabic scholars, distinguished Saudi scholar. And I asked him this question. I said, why are the Muslims so far behind when there's so much emphasis on ilm in the Quran? And he said, we live in a very strange world in the Muslim world. He said, either we are subject to the tyranny of the government, who will put us in jail. They'll say, if you don't toe the line, we'll put you in jail. Or the tyranny of the mullah, the religious leader, who will say, if you don't follow my version of Islam, you'll go to Jahannam. So he says, between Jahannam and jail, who's thinking, what are we going to come up with? And he thought, we are barely able to survive. And then he encapsulated the dilemma. I mean, why are you sitting here? Why am I sitting here when we should be sitting in our own environment and helping to create and grow it? We are sitting here because there are always the dangers of, I mean, in a sense, we are self-imposed exiles because we have been able to survive precisely because you're abroad and continuing to think and add and contribute to your society back home. So it's a sad comment, but at least you're still in the game. Your hat is in the game. And I believe till this is corrected in the long term, things will not be corrected because this compass, if you like, has to be corrected in our societies.
How well put, Dr. Ahmed, and I think you've nailed the current dilemma of Muslims and the Muslim world, how they've forsaken knowledge and how little they invest in education. So, I think this gives us a very good lead into our next program, in which we will explore these issues further about the state of sciences, about theology, about knowledge, and what happened after this golden age of Islam. So I'm going to get back to you, and viewers, please do join us again when I explore the next set of questions with Dr. Akbar Ahmed. Thank you for being with us.